Please, sir, the military museum is closing in 10 minutes. You'll need to make your way to the exit, the young curator's assistant said, her voice tinged with impatience as she gestured toward the elderly man standing alone before the Vietnam War exhibit. Harold Thompson, 79, leaned on his weathered wooden cane, his eyes fixed on a faded photograph of helicopter pilots. "Just a moment longer," he whispered, almost to himself. The assistant sighed audibly. 5 minutes later, as Harold was reluctantly shuffling toward the exit, the museum's head curator stepped into the hall, a stack of papers in hand. When Harold politely nodded and mentioned his name in passing, the curator's face drained of color. The papers slipped from his trembling fingers, scattering across the marble floor as he stared at the unassuming old man as though seeing a ghost. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Harold Thompson was a man who valued routine and solitude above all else. His modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Riverdale was meticulously organized, books aligned by subject matter on oak shelves, newspapers folded precisely after reading, and not a dish left unwashed. The only area that might appear chaotic to a visitor was his small home office, where maps, technical manuals, and faded photographs covered the walls in what seemed a haphazard fashion, but was, to Harold, a carefully constructed memory palace. Each Thursday afternoon for the past 15 years, Harold would dress in his best tweed jacket, the one with leather elbow patches that his late wife Catherine had gifted him on their 40th anniversary, polish his tortoise-shell glasses, and make the hour-long bus journey to the National Military Heritage Museum. His visits were never about nostalgia or seeking recognition. They were acts of remembrance, private pilgrimages to honor promises made decades ago in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia. Today was different, only because it was the anniversary, 55 years since Operation Black Hawk Valley, a classified mission that official military records listed simply as a reconnaissance operation with minimal engagement. Harold knew better. The 16 men who had ventured into that valley knew better, but only Harold had returned to tell the tale, and he had been ordered never to speak of what truly happened. He moved slowly through the museum halls, past displays of uniforms, weaponry, and tactical maps. School groups and tourists flowed around him like water around a stone, few sparing more than a glance for the elderly man with stooped shoulders and thoughtful eyes. Harold didn't mind. Invisibility had its advantages, especially when one carried secrets classified at the highest levels. The Vietnam War exhibit occupied the east wing of the museum's 3rd floor, a collection of artifacts, photographs, and interactive displays designed to educate visitors about what museum placards diplomatically called a complex conflict. Harold found it ironic how sanitized history became behind glass cases, how the mud, blood, and terror were reduced to informative paragraphs and carefully curated images. He paused before a large photograph of helicopter pilots standing before their Hueys, scanning the faces as he always did, looking for echoes of men he once knew. His gaze lingered on a display case containing jungle boots, sea rations, and a standard-issue compass identical to the one he still kept in his desk drawer at home. The display plaque read, "Standard Equipment for Reconnaissance Teams, 1968-1970. "Excuse me, sir." Harold turned to find a young woman, regarding him with polite impatience. She wore the museum's navy blue uniform and a name badge identifying her as Melissa, Assistant Curator. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but the museum will be closing in 10 minutes. We need to begin clearing the exhibits." Harold nodded. "Of course, just taking a moment to remember." Melissa's expression softened slightly. "Are you a veteran?" "Yes," Harold said simply, offering no elaboration. "Well, thank you." For your service, she replied automatically, the phrase worn smooth from repetition. If you're interested, we have a special Veterans Breakfast event this Saturday. There will be a guest speaker from the Department of Defense discussing recently declassified operations. Harold smiled faintly. That's very kind, but I prefer quiet visits. Melissa glanced at her watch. I understand. Still, I need to ask you to start making your way toward the exit now. Museum policy. Harold nodded again and began to move toward the stairs, his cane tapping softly against the polished floor. He'd barely taken 3 steps when a voice called from across the exhibit hall. 5 more minutes, folks. Please begin making your way to the exits. The voice belonged to Dr. Marcus Reed, the museum's head curator, a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s with salt-and-pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He was striding purposefully through the hall, a stack of papers in his hands, nodding politely to departing visitors. Harold continued his slow progress toward the exit, passing Dr. Reed with a courteous nod. Lovely exhibit, he offered quietly. Thompson, Harold Thompson, been coming here for years. Dr. Reed, who had been about to continue his rounds, froze mid-step. The papers he'd been carrying slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. His face, moments before professionally cordial, drained of color. Did you say Thompson? He managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold Thompson, from Special Operations Group Black Hawk Valley? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now it was Harold's turn to be surprised. He stared at the curator, confusion evident in his faded blue eyes. How could you possibly know about that? He asked, his voice suddenly sharp, the voice of a much younger man. Those records were sealed by presidential order. Dr. Reed seemed unable to speak for a moment, his gaze fixed on Harold's face as though searching for confirmation of something impossible. Finally he found his voice. Because my father was Robert Reed, Lieutenant Robert Reed. He told me about you before he died. He made me promise to find you someday, to thank you personally for what you did. Harold's cane clattered to the floor. Lieutenant Reed, Bobby Reed, the young communications officer who'd been with them on the mission, who'd sustained a critical injury, and whom Harold had carried for 11 miles through enemy territory after the extraction point was compromised. The man Harold had saved, only to be told upon their return that Lieutenant Reed had succumbed to his injuries at the field hospital. One more name on the list of those who never made it home. That's not possible, Harold whispered. They told me he died. They told all of us. Dr. Reed shook his head, tears forming in his eyes. They lied. The government needed everyone to believe the mission was a total loss. My father was placed in a specialized medical facility under a different name. He recovered eventually, but was sworn to secrecy about everything that happened. He never returned to active duty. Melissa, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion, stepped forward. Dr. Reed, is everything all right? We need to close the exhibits. Dr. Reed straightened, suddenly remembering where they were. Melissa, please inform security that I'll be staying late with a special guest and cancel my morning appointments tomorrow. He turned back to Harold, his professional demeanor giving way to profound emotion. Mr. Thompson, would you do me the honor of joining me in my office? There's something my father wanted you to have. Harold stood motionless, overwhelmed by revelations that were rewriting 55 years of grief and guilt. Around them, the last visitors were filing out, unaware of the seismic shift occurring in the quiet corner of the Vietnam exhibit. Finally, he bent down with effort to retrieve his fallen cane. Yes, he said, his voice steadier now. I believe I would like that very much. Dr. Reed's office was located in a section of the museum closed to the public, a spacious room lined with books and artifacts too delicate or valuable for regular display. He guided Harold to a comfortable leather chair before crossing to a small safe concealed behind a framed map of the Mekong Delta. "My father passed away 7 years ago," Dr. Reed explained as he worked the combination. "Heart failure. But he never forgot what happened in that valley, and he never forgot the man who carried him to safety when everyone else had given up." The safe door swung open, and he removed a small wooden box, handling it with reverence. "He made me promise that if I ever met you, which seemed impossible at the time, I would give you this and tell you that he lived a full life because of you, that he had a son who grew up to preserve history because of the stories his father told him about the importance of truth." Harold accepted the box with trembling hands. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded green cloth, lay a silver star medal and a folded piece of paper. With careful fingers, he unfolded the note, revealing handwriting that immediately transported him back 5 decades. "Harold, if you're reading this, then my son has finally found you. They made us swear never to contact each other, classified the entire operation, and erased it from history. But they couldn't erase what you did for me, for all of us. I've lived 50 years on borrowed time you gave me when you carried me through that jungle, talking to keep me conscious, promising we'd make it home even when we both knew it was nearly impossible. They gave this medal to my family when they thought I was dead. When I miraculously recovered, they let me keep it, but swore me to silence. It was never mine. It belongs to you, along with my eternal gratitude. Rest easy, brother. Not all of us were lost." Bobby Harold stared at the medal gleaming in the office's soft light, memories flooding back with overwhelming clarity. The helicopter extraction that went wrong, the ambush that separated their team, the desperate 11-mile trek through dense jungle with Lieutenant Reed slipping in and out of consciousness, Harold talking continuously to keep him alive, reciting baseball statistics, describing his hometown in Minnesota, anything to maintain that fragile connection to life. And then the final extraction, the field medics taking Reed from his arms, the debriefing where stone-faced officials informed them that Lieutenant Reed had succumbed to his injuries and that the entire operation was now classified at the highest level. The survivors were separated, reassigned, and ordered never to discuss what had happened in Black Hawk Valley. "I never knew," Harold whispered, looking up at Dr. Reed. "All these years, I thought I'd failed him. Failed all of them." Dr. Reed placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. "You didn't fail. My father lived to see me born, raised me, saw me graduate, walked me down the aisle at my wedding. Every moment of his life after that valley was because of you." Harold's eyes filled with tears he'd held back for half a century. The others? Did he know about any of the others? Dr. Reed shook his head sadly. "No. He tried to find out over the years, made discreet inquiries, but the government buried everything about that operation deeply. It wasn't until I became curator here 10 years ago that we started piecing things together." He gestured to his desk, where Harold now noticed a folder marked Black Hawk Valley Classified Research. "I've been gathering information, interviewing former intelligence officers, cross-referencing deployment records, trying to assemble the true story of what happened. But there were still so many gaps." He looked at Harold with newfound reverence. "Until today." Harold glanced at the folder, then back at the medal in his hands. For decades, he'd carried the weight of that mission alone, had mourned his comrades in private, had honored their memory with his silent visits to this museum. The thought of finally speaking their names aloud, of telling their story, sent a tremor through his weathered hands. "It was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance," he began hesitantly. the words feeling strange after so many years of silence. 16 of us dropped into the valley to gather intelligence on troop movements. We weren't supposed to engage, just observe and report, but something went wrong. As Harold spoke, Dr. Reed listened with rapt attention, occasionally making notes, but mostly absorbing the first-hand account of a mission that had been erased from official history. Outside the office windows, night fell over the museum grounds, but neither man noticed the passing hours as the true story of Black Hawk Valley emerged from the shadows of classified history. By the time Harold finished speaking, it was well past midnight. His voice was hoarse, but there was a lightness to his shoulders that had been absent when he entered the museum that afternoon. Dr. Reed sat back in his chair, visibly moved by what he had heard. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, "what you've shared tonight is invaluable, not just for historical records, but for the families of those 16 men. With your permission, I'd like to create a special exhibit honoring the Black Hawk Valley mission and the men who served in it." Harold considered, and this for a long moment. "The classification order expired 3 years ago," Dr. Reed finished. "Part of the mass declassification of Vietnam-era operations. The government didn't announce it because they assumed everyone involved was either dead or sworn to silence. They never expected anyone to connect the dots." He leaned forward eagerly. "This is a chance to set the record straight, to give those men the recognition they deserved 50 years ago." Harold thought of his comrades, their faces still vivid in his memory despite the passing decades. Men who had gone into that valley believing in their mission, who had fought bravely when things went wrong, who had died believing their sacrifice would be honored, men whose families had received only vague explanations and sealed coffins. "Yes," he said finally, "they deserve to have their story told, all of them." Dr. Reed nodded, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. "Then we'll begin tomorrow. But tonight—" He reached into a drawer and removed a bottle and 2 glasses. "Tonight, I think a toast is in order. To Lieutenant Robert Reed and the men of Black Hawk Valley, to truths long buried but finally coming to light." They raised their glasses in the quiet office, surrounded by artifacts of wars past, while outside the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. For Harold Thompson, it felt like the first new day after 55 years of darkness. A day when the weight of secrets might finally begin to lift, when the promise he had made to his fallen brothers that they would not be forgotten might at last be fulfilled. Tomorrow would bring questions, arrangements, the delicate work of reconstructing a mission erased from history. But tonight, in this moment, there was only the profound relief of recognition long deferred, of a burden shared, of a soldier's duty finally complete. The transformation in Harold Thompson was evident to anyone who knew him. In the weeks following his encounter with Dr. Marcus Reed at the National Military Heritage Museum, the once reclusive veteran walked with a straighter spine, spoke with renewed purpose, and even traded his austere tweed jacket for a navy blue blazer with a small American flag pin on the lapel. The burden of 55 years of silence had been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a mission that gave his twilight years unexpected meaning. Dr. Reed had been true to his word. The morning after their late-night conversation, he'd begun the process of creating a special exhibition dedicated to Operation Black Hawk Valley. The museum's board had initially expressed skepticism about dedicating resources to a previously classified mission with only one living witness. But Dr. Reed's passion and Harold's detailed testimony eventually won them over. The fact that Robert Reed had been the board chairman's commanding officer during a later deployment added weight to their proposal. "We'll need more than just your memories, though," Dr. Reed explained to Harold over coffee in the museum's staff lounge 3 days after their initial meeting. Photographs, letters, personal effects from the other team members, anything to bring these men to life for visitors. Harold nodded thoughtfully. I've kept some things, not much. They didn't let us take much when they reassigned us, but enough to start, and I might know how to find more. That afternoon, Harold made a phone call he'd been avoiding for decades. The number belonged to Grace Whitley, widow of Captain James Whitley, the team's commander. Harold had attended James's funeral, had awkwardly offered condolences to Grace and their young son, but had maintained his distance afterward, bound by secrecy orders and his own guilt at surviving when James had not. The conversation was difficult at first, filled with long pauses and careful words. But when Harold explained about the declassification, about the exhibition that would finally tell the true story of how her husband died, Grace's voice transformed. I have everything, Harold, she said, emotion making her voice tremble. All. His letters, his photographs, his personal effects they sent back. I've kept it all, waiting for the day someone would tell me what really happened to him. Similar calls followed, to siblings, children, and in a few cases, elderly parents of the Black Hawk Valley team. Some calls were met with suspicion, others with tearful gratitude, but each ended with promises to contribute to the exhibition. Packages began arriving at the museum, faded photographs, dog-eared letters, personal items that had been returned to families with no explanation of how their loved ones had died. Dr. Reed watched in amazement as Harold meticulously documented each item, recording the stories behind photographs, explaining the significance of seemingly ordinary objects, a lighter engraved with initials, a pocket knife with notches carved into the handle, a St. Christopher medal worn smooth from constant handling. You remember all of this? Dr. Reed asked one afternoon, watching Harold arrange a display case featuring the personal effects of Private First Class Michael Donovan, the team's youngest member at just 19. Every detail, Harold confirmed quietly. When you carry something this important for this long, nothing fades. Nothing gets forgotten. As word of the exhibition spread, more resources became available. A historian from the Department of Defense contacted Dr. Reed, offering recently declassified satellite imagery of Black Hawk Valley. A retired intelligence officer who had been peripherally involved in the operation sent handwritten notes on the mission planning. A journalist who had spent years investigating classified Vietnam operations contributed research files that helped corroborate Harold's account. Most surprisingly, 3 weeks into the project, Dr. Reed received a phone call from a nursing home in Arizona. A resident there, former Army Sergeant William Pearson, had read about the upcoming exhibition in a veterans newsletter and claimed to have been part of the support team for Operation Black Hawk Valley. That's impossible, Harold said when Dr. Reed told him. Everyone on the support team was told we'd all perished. That's why they never made contact. Nevertheless, Dr. Reed arranged a video call. The moment Harold saw the aged face on the screen, he gasped in recognition. Peterson? Bill Peterson from Communications? The elderly man on the screen broke into a weathered smile. It's Pearson, you old fool, always mixing up my name even back then. What followed was an emotional reunion between two men who had believed each other dead for over 5 decades. Bill Pearson had been part of the communications team at the forward operating base, had received the team's final transmission before everything went silent. Like many others, he'd been sworn to secrecy about the operation and reassigned immediately afterward. They told us everyone in the valley was lost, Pearson explained, his voice thick with emotion. All these years, I've carried that with me. The voices on that radio going silent, knowing I was the last person to hear them alive. And they told us the base had been overrun, Harold replied, shaking his head at the elaborate deception. When we finally made it to the extraction point, there was a different unit there, men who knew nothing about our mission. The conversation lasted hours, the two veterans filling in gaps in each other's understanding, piecing together a more complete picture of what had happened during those chaotic days in 1968. By the end, both men were exhausted, but visibly lighter, as though the simple act of speaking truth had physical weight. "Will you come for the exhibition opening?" Harold asked as they prepared to end the call. Pearson nodded firmly. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away. I've got some items too, copies of transmission logs, photographs of the communications center. I'll send them along." The exhibition took shape over the next 2 months. What had begun as a small display in a corner of the Vietnam War section evolved into a dedicated room with interactive elements, audio recordings, and a meticulously recreated diorama of Black Hawk Valley, based on Harold's descriptions and the satellite imagery. At the center stood 16 pedestals, each bearing the photograph and personal effects of one team member, arranged in the same formation they had taken when they were dropped into the valley. 15 of the pedestals were topped with eternal flames, small LED lights programmed never to extinguish. The 16th, Harold's, remained unlit, a silent acknowledgement of the survivor's journey. The night before the exhibition's official opening, Dr. Reed gave Harold a private tour. They walked slowly through the completed space, Harold pausing before each pedestal, touching items he had helped arrange, nodding in approval at the accuracy of the displays. "What do you think?" Dr. Reed asked finally, watching the elderly veteran's face for his reaction. Harold was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from display to display, taking in the culmination of their work. "It's more than I ever thought possible," he said finally, his voice thick. "For 55 years, these men existed only in my memory. Now," he gestured to the room around them, "now they're part of history again, real people with real stories that won't be forgotten." Dr. Reed nodded, understanding the profound significance of what they had accomplished. "There's one more thing," he said, leading Harold to a wall that had been covered during their preparations. He pressed a button and the covering slid away, revealing a large bronze plaque. "Operation Black Hawk Valley, April 16 to 18, 1968. For 55 years, this mission remained classified, its heroes unrecognized, its truth untold. 16 men entered the valley on a mission of vital intelligence gathering. Only one returned. This exhibition honors their sacrifice, courage, and the enduring power of truth that finally brought their story to light. Not all heroes wear medals. Some carry the weight of silence for those who no longer have voices. Harold Thompson, sole survivor. Harold stared at the plaque, then at Dr. Reed, momentarily speechless. "You used my words," he said finally. "They captured everything this exhibition represents," Dr. Reed replied simply. "Tomorrow, when the doors open, hundreds of people will read them and understand what these men sacrificed, not just their lives, but their place in history." The opening day dawned clear and bright. Harold arrived early, dressed in his new blazer, his silver hair neatly combed, his back straighter than it had been in years. He found the museum already bustling with activity, staff making final adjustments, press setting up cameras, and most surprisingly, a group of uniformed military personnel standing at attention near the exhibition entrance. Dr. Reed approached, looking both excited and slightly nervous. "Harold, there's been a development. The Secretary of the Army is here. Apparently, word of our exhibition reached the Pentagon and, well..." He gestured toward a distinguished group entering the museum lobby. "They've decided to make this official." Before Harold could process this information, he found himself being introduced to the Secretary of the Army, a serious-looking woman who shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Thompson, what you and Dr. Reed have accomplished here is remarkable. The Department of the Army wishes to formally acknowledge Operation Black Hawk Valley and properly honor its participants." The exhibition opening, which had been planned as a relatively modest affair, transformed into something far more significant. Families of the Black Hawk Valley team, who had traveled from across the country to attend, found themselves participating in an official military ceremony. Bill Pearson, who had arrived the previous evening from Arizona, sat beside Harold in a place of honor. As the Secretary of the Army addressed the gathered crowd, Harold looked out at the sea of faces, children and grandchildren of his fallen comrades, military personnel, museum patrons, and media representatives. In the front row sat Grace Whitley, now in her late 70s, clutching a folded flag and listening intently as the true story of her husband's heroism was finally told publicly. For too long, operational security concerns kept this mission unclassified, the Secretary was saying. While those concerns were valid in their time, they had the unfortunate effect of denying proper recognition to 16 brave men who undertook one of the most dangerous intelligence-gathering missions of the conflict. Today, we correct that oversight. One by one, posthumous Silver Star medals were presented to the families of the Black Hawk Valley team. Each presentation included a brief biography and specific mention of the individual's actions during the mission, details that Harold had provided during his work on the exhibition. Children who had grown up knowing little about how their fathers died now stood tall, accepting medals that acknowledged specific acts of bravery previously hidden by classification orders. When all 15 posthumous awards had been presented, the Secretary turned to Harold. "Master Sergeant Thompson, your country owes you a debt that extends beyond your actions in Black Hawk Valley. For 55 years you honored your oath of secrecy while never forgetting your fallen comrades. When declassification finally permitted the truth to emerge, you dedicated yourself to ensuring their story was told correctly and completely." She nodded to an aide, who stepped forward with a small case. "By order of the President of the United States, I am honored to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an opposing armed force in Black Hawk Valley, Vietnam, April 16–18, 1968. Harold, who had remained composed throughout the ceremony, found himself momentarily overwhelmed. He had never sought recognition, had spent decades believing that the truth of what happened in that valley would die with him. To stand here now, surrounded by the families of his comrades, receiving formal acknowledgement of a mission long erased from history, was beyond anything he could have imagined. With slightly trembling hands, he accepted the medal, then slowly turned to face the room. Before him were the children and grandchildren of the men he'd served with, many of whom he was meeting for the first time today. In their faces, he could see echoes of his fallen brothers, James Whitley's determined jaw in his grandson, Michael Donovan's quick smile in his niece, Robert Chen's thoughtful eyes in his daughter. "This medal," Harold began, his voice steady despite his emotion, "belongs to 16 men, not one. What happened in Black Hawk Valley wasn't the actions of individuals, but the courage of a team who believed in each other and their mission, even when everything went wrong." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "For 55 years, I've carried their stories, their faces, their last moments. It has been both a burden and a privilege. Today, that burden is lifted, not just for me, but for all of you who have lived, with questions unanswered and sacrifices unacknowledged." He gestured to the exhibition entrance behind him. "Through this door is the truth. Not perfect, not complete, but honest. The men you'll meet inside weren't perfect either. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and responded with extraordinary courage. They deserved to be remembered not as classified statistics, but as the heroes they truly were. After the ceremony concluded, Harold stood at the entrance to the exhibition, greeting each family personally as they entered to see the displays honoring their loved ones. He watched as children who had never known their fathers stood before photographs and personal items, touching display cases with reverent fingers. He answered questions, shared memories, and for the first time in decades spoke freely about the men he had known and lost. Late in the afternoon, as the initial crowds thinned, Harold found himself standing beside Bill Pearson before the central display, a detailed map of Black Hawk Valley with the team's route marked in red, ending at the extraction point where only Harold had emerged from the jungle. "Did you ever think you'd see this day?" Pearson asked quietly. Harold shook his head. "Not once in 55 years. I thought I'd take it all with me when I went. And instead, you've given it back." "To all of us," came a voice from behind them. They turned to find Grace Whitley, James's widow, holding her husband's silver star. "For decades, I imagined countless scenarios about how James died, each one worse than the last. Now I know he died saving his men, doing exactly what he would have wanted to do." She reached out and squeezed Harold's hand. "That knowledge is worth more than any medal." As evening approached, Dr. Reed found Harold sitting quietly on a bench in the exhibition room, watching as museum staff prepared to close for the day. The curator sat beside him, both men content in companionable silence for several minutes. "We did it," Dr. Reed said finally. 16 men who were erased from history are now immortalized. Their families have closure. The record is set straight." Harold nodded, his eyes on the 16 pedestals with their eternal flames. "Your father would be proud," he said, "not just of the exhibition, but of you, the man you became, the work you do here preserving history." Dr. Reed smiled, emotion evident in his expression. "I've been thinking about something you said when we first met, about how you came here. To honor promises made long ago. What will you do now that those promises have been fulfilled?" Harold considered the question carefully. The last 2 months had transformed him from a solitary figure burdened by secrets to a man with purpose, connections, and suddenly a future he hadn't planned for. The weight he'd carried for so long had been replaced by something lighter, but equally meaningful. "I think," he said slowly, "I'll keep coming on Thursdays, but not to remember alone anymore. There are school groups that visit, veterans who might have questions, families who might want to know more than what's written on the plaques." He gestured to the exhibition around them. "This isn't the end of something. It's the beginning." As they stood to leave, Harold paused before the bronze plaque with his quoted words. Dr. Reed noticed his thoughtful expression. "Second thoughts about being quoted?" Harold shook his head. "No, just thinking that there should be a second part to that quote now." He smiled, a genuine expression that erased years from his weathered face. "Not all heroes wear medals. Some carry the weight of silence for those who no longer have voices. But the greatest honor is when those voices can finally be heard again." Outside the museum, the setting sun cast long shadows across the grounds. Harold Thompson walked slowly toward the bus stop, no longer invisible, no longer alone with his memories. Behind him, inside the quiet museum, 16 eternal flames continued to burn, illuminating a truth that had waited 55 years to be told, a reminder that some stories, no matter how deeply buried, find their way into the light. In the 6 months following the opening of the Black Hawk Valley exhibition, the National Military Heritage Museum experienced an unprecedented surge in visitors. What had begun as a local human interest story, the chance meeting of an elderly, Veteran and a curator with a personal connection to a classified mission had captured national attention. Major news networks produced special reports on Operation Black Hawk Valley. Military historians published articles reassessing intelligence operations in Vietnam, and veterans organizations highlighted the story as an example of long overdue recognition. At the center of this unexpected spotlight stood Harold Thompson, a man who had spent more than 5 decades avoiding attention. Now, at 79, he found himself embracing a new role as the living embodiment of memory and reconciliation. 3 days a week, he could be found at the museum, seated on a bench near the entrance to the exhibition, ready to speak with anyone who approached, from curious schoolchildren to grizzled veterans, from family members of fallen soldiers to military historians seeking first-hand accounts. "You've become our most valuable exhibit," Dr. Reed joked one afternoon, finding Harold surrounded by a group of wide-eyed middle schoolers hanging on his every word. Harold smiled, a genuine expression that had become increasingly familiar on his once solemn face. "Not an exhibit," he corrected gently, "a bridge between then and now. This bridge extended far beyond the museum walls. The Black Hawk Valley Remembrance Project, initially established to fund the exhibition, had evolved into a nationwide effort to identify and properly recognize other classified operations whose participants had never received appropriate acknowledgement. Bill Pearson had become its most enthusiastic advocate, traveling to veterans' homes and military bases across the country, collecting testimonies from aging servicemen and women who, like Harold, had carried classified burdens in silence. "We've identified 17 operations so far," Pearson reported during one of his regular video calls with Harold. "Mostly Vietnam, but a few from Korea and even early Cold War missions. The pattern's always the same: critical intelligence missions, high casualty rates, immediate classification, and survivors sworn to secrecy and reassigned." "And the families?" Harold asked, knowing this was what mattered most. "They're finding each other," Pearson confirmed. "We've created online forums where they can connect, share information, support each other. For many, it's the first time they've spoken with anyone who understands what they've been through." The project had attracted powerful allies. The Secretary of the Army, impressed by the positive response to the Black Hawk Valley recognition ceremony, had established a dedicated review board to examine classified operations for potential declassification and appropriate honors. Several influential senators had joined the cause, pushing for legislation to streamline the process and ensure timely recognition. Yet for Harold, the most meaningful developments were the small, personal connections formed in the quiet moments between public events, like the Wednesday afternoon when Grace Whitley brought her great-granddaughter to the museum, a bright-eyed 7-year-old named Jamie, after her great-grandfather James. "She's been asking about him," Grace explained, as the little girl explored the exhibition. "I never knew what to tell her before. Now I can bring her here, show her who he really was." Harold watched as Jamie stood before her great-grandfather's pedestal, solemnly studying his photograph and the items in the display case: his dog tags, a pocket watch, letters he'd written to Grace. The eternal flame cast a warm glow on her upturned face, creating a moment of connection across generations that Harold found profoundly moving. "He looks like my dad," Jamie observed, pointing to the photograph, "and like me around the eyes." "He does," Harold agreed, kneeling despite his arthritic knees to reach her eye level. "And do you know what else? He was brave, just like I bet you are." Jamie considered this seriously. "Was he scared sometimes too?" "Oh yes," Harold said, remembering his commander's rare moments of vulnerability, shared only in the darkest nights of their mission. "Being brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." The child nodded, absorbing this wisdom with the gravity only a 7-year-old could muster. "I'm going to write about him for school," she declared. about his bravery and his watch and his letters to great-grandma. Later, as Grace prepared to leave, she embraced Harold with unexpected emotion. "You've given Jamie something I never could," she whispered. "A hero to look up to, a legacy to be proud of. James would be so grateful." Such moments sustained Harold through the inevitable challenges that came with his new public role. There were skeptics who questioned the accuracy of his recollections after so many years, conspiracy theorists who claimed the entire operation was fabricated, and occasionally protesters who objected to any positive portrayal of Vietnam War operations. Dr. Reed became fiercely protective, screening media requests and monitoring visitor interactions when Harold seemed tired. "You don't have to do this every day," he reminded the elderly veteran frequently. "No one would think less of you if you scaled back." But Harold was driven by a sense of purpose more powerful than fatigue. "I spent 55 years unable to speak," he would reply. "Now that I can, every day matters." The approach of Veterans Day, the first since the exhibition's opening, brought a flurry of invitations for Harold to speak at ceremonies across the country. He declined most, preferring to remain at the museum where he felt closest to his comrades. However, one invitation proved impossible to refuse, a request from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., to participate in a special candlelight vigil honoring previously unrecognized operations. "They're adding a plaque," Dr. Reed explained, showing Harold the formal invitation, "adjacent to the wall. It will acknowledge classified operations and those who couldn't be properly recognized at the time. Black Hawk Valley will be the first named operation." And so, on a crisp November evening, Harold found himself standing before the black granite wall that bore the names of over 58,000 American servicemen and women who had died in Vietnam. Among them were his 15 teammates, their names previously just anonymous entries among thousands, now illuminated by special markers placed by park rangers earlier that day. The ceremony was solemn but not somber. Hundreds of veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, many in uniform decorated with medals and ribbons, others in civilian clothes with only a small pin or patch to indicate their service. Family members held candles, creating a river of light that flowed along the memorial wall. Military officials and government representatives stood respectfully to one side, allowing the focus to remain on the veterans and families. When Harold was introduced, the crowd fell silent. He had prepared remarks, carefully written out in his neat, precise handwriting, but as he looked out at the sea of faces illuminated by candlelight, he set the paper aside. "I stand before you tonight not as an individual, but as a representative," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "I represent 15 men who entered Black Hawk Valley alongside me and never returned. I represent hundreds of others who participated in classified operations across multiple conflicts, whose sacrifices remained unacknowledged for decades. And I represent thousands of family members who lived with questions that had no answers, with grief that had no proper outlet." He gestured to the wall behind him. "This memorial has always held the names of my teammates, but until recently, few knew the true circumstances of their sacrifice. Their story, our story, was hidden behind classification orders and security concerns that may have been valid in their time, but carried a heavy human cost." Harold paused, looking out at the assembled veterans, many of whom nodded in silent understanding. "I spent 55 years honoring my oath of secrecy while trying to honor my promise to my fallen brothers. Those dual commitments often seemed at odds, creating a solitude that many of you here tonight will understand all too well." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Harold saw weathered faces illuminated by candlelight, eyes that reflected similar burdens carried for decades. "What I've learned in these past months is that silence, no matter how necessary, exacts a terrible price. not just from those who maintain it, but from those who are left wondering, waiting for truths that never come. He turned slightly, acknowledging the families standing nearby. The exhibition at the National Military Heritage Museum has allowed 16 men to reclaim their place in history. The plaque being dedicated tonight will do the same for hundreds more. But this is just the beginning. Harold straightened his shoulders, his voice growing stronger. To my fellow veterans of classified operations, your time for recognition has come. To the families who have waited decades for answers, your patience and perseverance honor those you lost. And to a nation that is finally ready to hear these stories, listen carefully, for they contain lessons about sacrifice, duty, and the true cost of secrecy that remain relevant today. As Harold concluded his remarks, a military bugler stepped forward to play taps. The mournful notes echoed across the memorial grounds, a sound familiar to every service member present. Harold stood at attention, his right hand raised in a salute that he held until the final note faded into the night. Around him, hundreds of others did the same, a forest of salutes illuminated by candlelight, honoring sacrifices long hidden, but never forgotten. Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and the official ceremonies concluded, Harold found himself alone before the section of the wall where his teammates' names were engraved. Dr. Reed, who had accompanied him to Washington, had tactfully withdrawn to give him privacy. Harold reached out, his fingertips tracing the engraved letters of names he had carried in his heart for half a century. James Whitley, Michael Donovan, Robert Chen, and 12 others who had entered Black Hawk Valley on that fateful April morning. In 1968, the stone felt cool beneath his touch, solid and permanent, unlike the fragile, fading memories he had fought so long to preserve. "It's done," he said quietly to the names before him. "The mission is complete. You're part of history now, just as you should have been all along." A gentle hand on his shoulder startled him from his reverie. He turned to find a young Army lieutenant standing beside him, her uniform immaculate, her expression respectful, but hesitant. "Forgive the interruption, Master Sergeant Thompson," she said. "I've been waiting for a chance to speak with you privately." Harold nodded, curious about this unexpected encounter. "Of course, Lieutenant. Rodriguez, Emma Rodriguez." She glanced at the wall, then back to Harold. "My grandfather was Antonio Rodriguez. He worked in military intelligence during Vietnam. He passed away last year." Harold waited, sensing there was more to this story. "Before he died, he told me something he'd never shared with anyone," Lieutenant Rodriguez continued. "He was part of the intelligence team that analyzed the information recovered from Black Hawk Valley. He said..." Her voice faltered slightly. "He said it was the most significant intelligence coup of the entire conflict, that the information your team gathered saved thousands of American lives by exposing a planned offensive." Harold stared at her, momentarily speechless. In all the debriefings, all the classified hearings, no one had ever told him, or the other survivors, what had become of the intelligence they'd fought so desperately to extract from the valley. "Are you certain?" he asked finally. "Lieutenant." Rodriguez nodded firmly. "My grandfather kept a private journal, encrypted in his own code. After your story became public, I finally understood parts of it that had never made sense before. He wrote that the Black Hawk Valley intelligence was the turning point in his career, the moment when he realized the true cost of the information that crossed his desk." She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small, carefully folded piece of paper. "He wrote this note years ago, with instructions to deliver it if the Black Hawk Valley operation ever became public. I've been carrying it since the exhibition opened, waiting for the right moment." With slightly trembling hands, Harold accepted the folded paper. Inside was a brief message written in a firm, clear hand. "To the men of Black Hawk Valley, the Intelligence you provided prevented a major offensive that would have cost thousands of American lives. Security protocols prevented us from ever telling you this. While this knowledge cannot bring back those who were lost, I hope it might bring some peace to those who survived. Your sacrifice was not in vain. It mattered more than you were ever told. Antonio Rodriguez, Senior Intelligence Analyst, 1965-1979. Harold read the note twice, then carefully refolded it. "Thank you for this," he said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "Your grandfather has answered a question I stopped asking decades ago." Lieutenant Rodriguez smiled, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "He would be honored to know. It reached you, and She straightened, assuming a more formal posture. "I wanted you to know that your story has changed how many of us in the current military think about classified operations and the people who carry them out. There are ongoing discussions at the highest levels about establishing better protocols for eventual recognition, about considering the human cost of indefinite secrecy." She glanced at her watch and stepped back. "I should go. Thank you for your time, Master Sergeant, and for your service, all of it, acknowledged and unacknowledged." As Lieutenant Rodriguez walked away, Harold turned back to the wall, to the names of his comrades, illuminated by the gentle spotlights that kept the memorial visible throughout the night. Antonio Rodriguez's note burned in his pocket like a talisman. A final piece of a puzzle he had long ago accepted would remain incomplete. It mattered. It mattered more than you were ever told. The following morning, before returning to the airport, Harold asked Dr. Reed to make one more stop. They drove to Arlington National Cemetery, where Harold had arranged to visit the graves of 3 Black Hawk Valley team members who had been interred there: James Whitley, Robert Chen, and Thomas Gonzalez. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning light, the rows of white headstones stretching across the rolling landscape in perfect alignment. Harold moved slowly among them, Dr. Reed a respectful few paces behind, until he found the markers he sought. At each grave, Harold stood in silence for several minutes, then carefully placed a small item at the base of the headstone, a unit patch identical to the one he had carried hidden in his jacket for decades, now preserved and mounted in a small, weatherproof case. Finally, he rendered a precise salute to each of his fallen comrades. At the last grave, that of Private First Class Thomas Gonzalez, the youngest member of the team at barely 19, Harold lingered longer than at the others. Dr. Reed noticed him removing something from his pocket, the note from Antonio Rodriguez, and carefully reading it again before returning it to his jacket. "I never told Tommy enough," Harold said quietly as they finally turned to leave. "He was so young, so scared sometimes. I should have told him more often that what we were doing mattered, that he was making a difference." He paused, looking back at the simple white headstone. "I hope he knows now." On the flight home, Harold was uncharacteristically silent, gazing out the window at the landscape passing below. Dr. Reed, concerned by his withdrawn mood, finally spoke up. "Are you all right? Was the trip too much?" Harold turned from the window, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I was just thinking about something Lieutenant Rodriguez said last night, about how our story is changing protocols for current classified operations." He shook his head slightly. "All these years, I've been looking backward, trying to honor the past. I never considered how it might shape the future. That's how history works," Dr. Reed observed. "We study the past, not just to honor it, but to learn from it, to do better going forward." Harold nodded slowly. "When we return, I'd like to expand the educational program around the exhibition, not just for school children, but for military personnel, for intelligence officers in training. If our experience can prevent others from carrying the same burdens we did, that would be a legacy worth leaving." Dr. Reed smiled, already mentally sketching the outline of such a program. "I think that's an excellent idea. The museum board will certainly support it, especially with the attention the exhibition has received. Harold turned back to the window, but his expression had lightened. 55 years of silence, and now I can't seem to stop finding new ways to tell the story. He chuckled softly. The men would find that ironic. I was always the quiet one. As their plane began its descent toward home, Harold Thompson looked down at the sprawling landscape of the country he had served in ways that had gone unrecognized for most of his life. The burden he had carried for so long, the weight of silence, of unacknowledged sacrifice, of promises kept in solitude, had transformed into something else entirely. A mission of memory and meaning that extended far beyond the 16 men of Black Hawk Valley. It was a mission without classified orders or extraction timelines, without radio silence or security clearances. A mission of connection rather than secrecy, of recognition rather than anonymity. A mission perfectly suited to a man who had spent decades honoring the past and now found himself, unexpectedly, helping to shape the future. The legacy of Harold Thompson and the men of Black Hawk Valley would not be measured in medals or monuments, though these now existed. It would be measured in the protocols changed, the families connected, the stories finally told. It would be measured in the understanding that true heroism lies not just in the actions taken during moments of crisis, but in the quiet dignity with which burdens are carried long after, in the perseverance that keeps faith with those who can no longer speak for themselves. And for an old soldier who had walked alone with his memories for 55 years, perhaps the greatest victory was the simplest. The knowledge that when he joined his comrades beyond this life, he would do so having fulfilled his final mission, ensuring that their sacrifices, though hidden for decades behind veils of classification, would remain illuminated for generations to come, eternal flames against the darkness of forgetting. The spring following the Veterans Day ceremony brought unexpected changes to Harold Thompson's life. What began as a persistent cough during the harsh winter months developed into pneumonia that left the elderly veteran hospitalized for 3 weeks. Though he recovered with characteristic determination, the illness took a toll that even his iron will couldn't fully overcome. His doctors, concerned about his lung capacity, recommended a warmer, drier climate. Arizona, Bill Pearson suggested, during one of their regular video calls, his weathered face filling Harold's tablet screen. The retirement community where I live has an apartment opening up next month. Good medical facilities nearby, and you'd have a built-in friend who understands. Harold, sitting in his small apartment surrounded by the modest possessions of his solitary life, found himself considering the offer seriously. For decades he had defined himself by his routines, by the familiar contours of a life built around privacy and quiet remembrance. The thought of uprooting himself at 79 seemed almost unthinkable. And yet, the past year had redefined everything he thought he knew about his place in the world. The exhibition, the Remembrance Project, the connections formed with families and fellow veterans, all had pulled him out of the solitude he had both cultivated and endured for so long. What about the museum? Harold asked, thinking of his regular schedule, the visitors who sought him out, the educational programs he had helped develop. Technology, Pearson replied with a grin, holding up his tablet. We're using it right now, aren't we? You could still participate virtually. Make seasonal visits when your health permits. Dr. Reed seems like the type who would make it work. Indeed, when Harold broached the subject with Dr. Reed during their next meeting at the museum, the curator was immediately supportive. Your health comes first, he insisted, waving away Harold's concerns about abandoning his commitments. We've already digitized so much of your testimony and involvement with the exhibition. Virtual tours, recorded interviews, live video sessions. With school groups, we can make this work. Dr. Reed leaned forward, his expression earnest. Besides, this might be the next evolution of the project, expanding beyond a single location, reaching people who can't come to the museum. Your move could be the catalyst for something important. A month later, Harold found himself standing in his emptied apartment, a lifetime of possessions sorted, packed, or donated. The space looked strangely larger without his belongings, the walls bare where photographs had hung, the bookshelves empty of the military histories and biographies he had accumulated over decades. As he made a final walkthrough, Harold paused at the small home office that had been his sanctuary. The maps and photographs that had once covered the walls were now carefully preserved in archival boxes, destined for the museum's permanent collection. His desk, where he had spent countless hours writing detailed accounts of Black Hawk Valley for the exhibition, stood empty, its worn surface bearing the faint impressions of his pen strokes. A gentle knock at the open door interrupted his reverie. Grace Whitley stood there, a small gift bag in her hand. "I heard you were leaving today," she said, stepping into the room. "I couldn't let you go without saying goodbye in person." Harold smiled, genuinely pleased to see her. Over the past year, their shared connection to James Whitley had evolved into a friendship neither had anticipated. "It's not goodbye," he assured her. "More of a change of location. I'll be back for visits." Grace nodded, but her eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. "It won't be the same without you here." She held out the gift bag. "A little something for your new home, from all of us." Inside, Harold found a digital picture frame already loaded with photographs, images from the exhibition opening, from family gatherings where he had been an honored guest, from the Veterans Day ceremony in Washington. Interspersed were historical photographs of the Black Hawk Valley team, restored and colorized, showing young men with their lives ahead of them, smiling at a camera half a century ago. "There are over 100 images," Grace explained. "We all contributed, the families, Dr. Reed, the museum staff. So you'll have us with you wherever you are." Harold studied the frame, watching as the images transitioned from one to another, each representing a connection formed, a memory preserved, a promise kept. "This is—" He paused, searching for adequate words. "This means more than I can express." Grace smiled, understanding in her eyes. "James always said actions matter more than words. What you've done for all of us, bringing our loved ones back into history, giving us answers we thought we'd never have. There aren't words enough for that either." As they said their goodbyes, Grace surprised Harold with a warm embrace. "You're family now," she told him firmly. "To all of us. Don't forget that." The journey to Arizona marked Harold's first flight since returning from Vietnam. As the plane rose above the clouds, he found himself reflecting on how thoroughly his life had transformed in the span of 18 months. From a solitary veteran bound by secrecy and routine, to a man with a mission, with connections, with a future still unfolding in unexpected ways. Bill Pearson was waiting at the airport, leaning on a cane but standing tall, his Army veteran cap perched proudly on his head. The two men embraced without self-consciousness, their shared experiences bridging the decades since they had served together. "Welcome to your next deployment, Thompson," Pearson said with a grin. "I think you'll find the accommodations considerably improved since our last posting." Indeed, the retirement community exceeded Harold's expectations. His apartment, though modest, was bathed in natural light, with a small patio overlooking a desert garden where hummingbirds darted among vibrant flowers. The community center offered activities ranging from art classes to history lectures, and the on-site medical clinic provided the specialized respiratory care his doctors had recommended. Most importantly, Harold found himself among peers, men and women who had lived through the same era, who understood references to events and cultural touchstones without explanation, who carried their own histories of service and sacrifice. For someone who had spent decades in self-imposed isolation, the easy camaraderie was both challenging and unexpectedly rewarding. Pearson, true to his nature, wasted no time integrating Harold into community life. "We have a veterans coffee group that meets every Tuesday," he announced during Harold's first week. "And I've already told them who you are, so prepare to be bombarded with questions." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Who I am? The man who broke through 55 years of classification to ensure his teammates got the recognition they deserved." Pearson replied matter-of-factly. "The living witness to Operation Black Hawk Valley, the catalyst for the Remembrance Project." He grinned at Harold's discomfort with these descriptions. "Get used to it, Thompson. You're something of a celebrity in certain circles." This proved accurate. At his first veterans coffee meeting, Harold found himself surrounded by former service members eager to hear his story firsthand. Many had followed the news coverage of the exhibition opening and the subsequent Veterans Day ceremony. Some had served in Vietnam themselves in various capacities and offered perspectives that added new dimensions to Harold's understanding of the broader conflict. Among them was Raymond Fitzgerald, a former intelligence officer who had worked at the Pentagon during the period when the Black Hawk Valley intelligence was being analyzed. "I never knew the source," Fitzgerald explained, as he and Harold sat in a quiet corner of the community center after the main gathering had dispersed. "Everything was compartmentalized back then, but I remember the aftermath, the sudden shift in operational planning, the redeployment of resources. Something came. And that changed the entire strategic picture, and now I know it was what your team provided." Harold studied the former intelligence officer thoughtfully. "Did you ever question the cost, the human cost of the intelligence that crossed your desk?" Fitzgerald's expression sobered. "Every day. That's partly why I left the service after Vietnam. The disconnect between the analytical world and the operational reality, it was too great." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What your team did, what you personally did in carrying that intelligence out, it saved countless lives. But the way the government handled the aftermath, the secrecy, the lack of recognition, that was a failure of a different kind." Such conversations became a regular part of Harold's new life. The retirement community, it turned out, was home to dozens of veterans from multiple conflicts, each with their own stories, their own unresolved questions, their own perspectives on how military service had shaped their lives. For the first time, Harold found himself among people who truly understood aspects of his experience that civilians, however well-meaning, could never fully grasp. His connection to the museum remained strong, though transformed by distance. Twice weekly, Harold participated in virtual tours of the Black Hawk Valley exhibition, his image projected on a large screen where visitors could interact with him directly, asking questions and hearing first-hand accounts of the mission. For school groups, these sessions became a highlight, the opportunity to speak with a living historical figure who had experienced events they had only read about in textbooks. Dr. Reed, ever innovative, developed a special program where veterans from around the country could participate in virtual roundtable discussions with Harold and Bill Pearson, sharing experiences and perspectives that spanned decades of military service. These sessions were recorded, transcribed, and added to the museum's growing archive of first-hand accounts. "You've started something remarkable," Dr. Reed told Harold during one of their regular video calls. "Veterans who've never spoken about their experiences are coming forward, inspired by your example. Families are finding answers they've sought for decades. Military historians are re-evaluating entire operations based on newly available testimonies." Harold, still uncomfortable with personal recognition, redirected the conversation. "What about the educational impact? Are we reaching the right people?" Dr. Reed's expression brightened, beyond our expectations. We've had requests from military academies to incorporate the Black Hawk Valley case study into their ethics curriculum. 3 universities are developing courses on the long-term impacts of classification on veterans and families. And most significantly, Daddy paused for effect. The Department of Defense has invited us to consult on new protocols for the eventual declassification and recognition of sensitive operations. This last development particularly satisfied Harold. The thought that future generations of service members might be spared the decades of silence he had endured, that families might receive answers within years rather than half-centuries, represented a legacy far more meaningful than personal accolades. As months passed, Harold settled into his new environment, his health gradually improving in the desert climate. The persistent cough receded, his energy levels increased, and he found himself able to participate more fully in community activities. He joined a weekly writing group, began swimming in the community pool for exercise, and even at Pearson's insistent urging, took up painting, discovering to his surprise a natural aptitude for capturing desert landscapes in watercolors. "You're blooming late, Thompson," Pearson observed one evening as they sat on Harold's patio, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Who would have thought the quiet, by-the-book soldier I knew would turn into an artist in his 80s? Harold smiled, considering the observation. Maybe not so much changing as uncovering parts that were always there, just buried under other priorities. Pearson nodded thoughtfully, like excavating an archaeological site, clearing away the layers, finding what's preserved underneath. He raised his glass in a toast. To excavation, then, to discovering what remains when the weight is lifted. That night, unable to sleep, Harold sat at his desk and began writing, not the meticulous factual accounts he had produced for the museum, but something more personal. He wrote about the young man he had been before Vietnam, about dreams deferred and paths not taken, about the weight of secrets carried for decades and the unexpected lightness that came with their release. He wrote until dawn, painted the desert sky, filling page after page with reflections he had never before allowed himself to articulate. The next morning, bleary-eyed but strangely invigorated, he showed the pages to his writing group. Their response was unanimous. This was the beginning of a memoir that needed to be completed, a personal complement to the historical record preserved in the museum exhibition. Over the following months, with encouragement from his writing group and editorial, guidance from Dr. Reed, Harold expanded these initial reflections into a full manuscript. Unlike the exhibition, which focused primarily on the mission itself and its historical significance, the memoir explored the personal cost of classified service, the isolation, the divided identity, the complex interplay of duty and human connection. When the manuscript was complete, Harold initially hesitated to pursue publication. The exhibition tells the historical story, he argued during a video call with Dr. Reed. That's what matters for the public record. The exhibition tells what happened, Dr. Reed countered. Your memoir tells what it meant, what it cost, what it changed, what it preserved. Both perspectives are essential for a complete understanding. Eventually persuaded, Harold submitted the manuscript to a publishing house specializing in military history and memoirs. Their response was immediate and enthusiastic. Silent Witness, a soldier's journey from classified operation to public. Recognition was scheduled for publication the following spring, coinciding with the second anniversary of the Black Hawk Valley exhibition opening. As the publication date approached, Harold received an unexpected phone call from Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez, the intelligence officer who had delivered Antonio Rodriguez's note at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. "Master Sergeant Thompson," she began formally, then softened her tone. "Mr. Thompson, I'm calling with some news that might interest you. The protocols we discussed in Washington, they've been implemented. The first declassification under the new guidelines happened last week. Operation Silver Shield, Cambodia, 1970. The surviving team members have been notified and a recognition ceremony is being planned. Harold sat down, absorbing the significance of this development. How many survivors? 3, sir. All in their 70s now. They've been sworn to secrecy for 53 years. And the families of those who didn't survive? Being contacted as we speak. Full disclosure, appropriate honors, access to previously classified records, everything your project advocated for. Harold closed his eyes briefly, imagining the impact of such news on people who, like the Black Hawk Valley families, had lived with unanswered questions for decades. Thank you for telling me this. There's more, Lieutenant Rodriguez continued. The Secretary of the Army asked me to extend a personal invitation. They would like you and Mr. Pearson to attend the recognition ceremony as honored guests. Your experience with the Black Hawk Valley project directly informed the protocols being implemented. In many ways, these veterans are receiving proper recognition because of the path you pioneered. The Silver Shield recognition ceremony, held at Fort Benning 3 months later, echoed the Black Hawk Valley event in many ways. The posthumous medals, the emotional family members, the formal acknowledgement of sacrifice long unrecognized. But there were significant differences as well. This time, the ceremony was not the result of a chance encounter and subsequent grassroots effort, but a deliberate action by the military establishment, following protocols specifically designed to address the human cost of prolonged classification. Harold and Bill Pearson sat in the front row, distinguished guests rather than central participants. They watched as 3 elderly veterans, men who had carried burdens similar to Harold's for over 5 decades, received the recognition they had never expected to see in their lifetimes. They witnessed families receive detailed accounts of loved ones' actions, documentation that transformed vague official statements into meaningful narratives of service and sacrifice. "This is what success looks like," Pearson murmured as they observed the proceedings. Not medals or mentions in history books, but systems changed, patterns broken, injustices prevented from repeating. Harold nodded, a profound sense of fulfillment washing over him. The cycle of silence that had defined his life for so long had been interrupted. The pattern of necessary secrecy followed by unnecessary obscurity had been recognized and addressed. The burden he had carried would still fall on the shoulders of those who served in classified operations. National security would always require discretion, but it would not be a life sentence of silence, not anymore. After the ceremony, one of the Silver Shield veterans approached Harold, his eyes bright with emotion. "They told us about you," he said, extending his hand, "about how you broke through the silence after all those years, about how you made this possible for us." He gestured to the medal newly pinned to his chest, to the family members gathered nearby. "I never thought I'd see this day. Never thought I'd be able to tell my grandchildren what really happened, why their uncle never came home. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it." Harold clasped the man's hand firmly. "You carried the weight. You kept faith with your teammates. What happened today isn't because of me. It's because the system finally recognized what was owed to you and your fallen comrades." The man smiled, understanding the deflection for what it was, the natural response of someone who had never sought recognition for himself, only for others. "Well, thank you anyway," he said simply, "for showing that even after 50 years, the truth can still find its way into the light." As Harold and Pearson prepared to leave the ceremony, Lieutenant Rodriguez approached with a senior officer Harold didn't recognize. "Master Sergeant Thompson, Mr. Pearson, may I introduce Colonel James Harrington, Director of the newly established Historical Recognition Division." Colonel Harrington shook their hands with genuine respect. "Gentlemen, I wanted to meet you. Personally, the protocols we're implementing, the division I now lead, they exist in large part because of what you accomplished with the Black Hawk Valley project. You've changed how the military thinks about the long-term impacts of classification, about our responsibility to veterans and families. He handed each of them a business card. We're identifying operations for review and declassification. If you have insights or recommendations, my door is always open. On the flight back to Arizona, Harold sat quietly, watching the landscape. Pass below, much as he had a year earlier when leaving his old life behind. Beside him, Pearson dozed peacefully, his veteran's cap pulled low over his eyes. Harold's thoughts drifted to the Silver Shield veterans, to the families who had received answers today, to the systems being put in place to ensure that future generations would not endure decades of unnecessary silence. The mission that had begun with a chance encounter in a museum, the mission to honor his fallen comrades, to ensure their place in history, had expanded far beyond anything he could have imagined. It had become something larger, something that would outlast him, something that would continue to bring light to stories long hidden in shadow. As the plane descended toward Phoenix, Harold thought of the painting waiting on his easel at home, a desert landscape at dawn, light breaking over distant mountains, illuminating a path forward. There was something fitting about that image, about the idea of light returning after darkness, of clarity emerging after obscurity, of recognition following years of invisibility. For Harold Thompson, who had lived most of his life carrying the weight of classified silence, the greatest victory was not in medals or memoirs or museum exhibitions. It was in the knowledge that the path he had walked alone for so long was now being widened into a road that others could follow. A road leading from necessary secrecy to eventual recognition, from solitary remembrance to shared history, from the shadows of classification to the light of acknowledged truth. The publication of Silent Witness in the spring coincided with Harold's 80th birthday, a milestone he had once expected to pass with little acknowledgement beyond his own quiet reflection. Instead, he found himself at the center of a celebration that bridged continents and generations, a virtual gathering organized by Dr. Reed that brought together the Black Hawk Valley families, museum staff, military officials, and fellow veterans from across the country. "I feel ambushed," Harold commented dryly to Bill Pearson as the guest list continued to grow on his tablet screen. "You were in on this, weren't you?" Pearson grinned, unrepentant. "Consider it payback for all those pre-dawn reconnaissance drills. You ran us through back in '68. Some debts take decades to collect." The celebration, though overwhelming for someone who had spent most of his life avoiding attention, proved deeply meaningful. Former intelligence officers shared how the Black Hawk Valley project had changed institutional thinking about classified operations. Military educators described how Harold's story had become required reading at service academies, prompting discussions about the ethical dimensions of secrecy and recognition. Family members of the Black Hawk Valley team expressed how the exhibition and memoir had transformed their understanding of relatives they had never had the chance to know. Most surprisingly, a group of young service members currently deployed overseas appeared on screen, their faces tired but earnest as they explained how Harold's journey had affected their perspective on their own classified work. "Knowing that there are protocols in place now, that our actions won't disappear into redacted files forever, it matters, sir," a young sergeant explained, the desert sun casting harsh shadows across her face. "It changes how we think about what we're doing, knowing it will eventually be acknowledged, even if not in our lifetime." As the celebration wound down, Dr. Reed made an announcement that caught Harold completely off guard. The Black Hawk Valley exhibition has been recognized by the American Alliance of Museums as the Outstanding Military History Exhibition of the Year. More significantly, it has been selected for permanent installation with plans for traveling. Versions to tour military bases and educational institutions nationwide. Harold stared at the screen, momentarily speechless. What had begun as a personal quest to honor 15 fallen comrades had evolved into something that would continue to educate and inspire long after he was gone. The thought was both humbling and profoundly satisfying. Later that evening, as Harold sat on his patio watching the desert sunset, he reflected on the strange trajectory his life had taken. For decades, he had defined himself by absence, by what he couldn't say, by the connections he couldn't make, by the recognition that couldn't be acknowledged. Now, in his 8th decade, he found himself defined by presence, by truth spoken, after years of silence, by connections formed across generations, by recognition that extended far beyond himself to touch the lives of others who had carried similar burdens. The memoir's publication brought a new dimension to Harold's unexpected public role. Invitations arrived from universities, veterans organizations, and military installations, all requesting his participation in discussions about the long-term impacts of classified service. While his health limited his ability to travel extensively, technology allowed him to engage with audiences across the country from the comfort of his Arizona apartment. These virtual appearances revealed a side of Harold that surprised even those who had come to know him well over the past 2 years. A natural educator with a gift for translating complex ethical questions into relatable human terms, for helping civilians understand the unique challenges faced by those who serve in classified operations, and for encouraging veterans to recognize the value of their own stories, classified or not. "You've found your 3rd career," Pearson observed, after watching Harold skillfully navigate a particularly challenging panel discussion that included both Vietnam-era intelligence officers and contemporary critics of military classification policies. First a soldier, then a keeper of secrets, now a bridge builder between worlds that rarely communicate effectively. Harold considered this assessment thoughtfully. Less a career than a calling, perhaps. Something I didn't choose, so much as stumble into when circumstances finally permitted. This calling led to an unexpected invitation that arrived 6 months after the memoir's publication, a request from the Congressional Medal of Honor Society to deliver the keynote address at their annual gathering, focusing on the theme of recognition, deferred, honoring service beyond the battlefield. "They want me to speak to Medal of Honor recipients?" Harold asked incredulously when Dr. Reed forwarded the invitation. "These are America's most decorated veterans. What could I possibly say that would be relevant to them?" "Perhaps that's precisely why they asked you," Dr. Reed suggested. "Your experience represents a different kind of service, one without immediate recognition, without public understanding, without the supportive framework that accompanies acknowledged heroism. They want to understand that perspective." After careful consideration and considerable encouragement from both Pearson and Dr. Reed, Harold accepted the invitation. The speech would require careful preparation, balancing respect for the extraordinary heroism represented by the Medal of Honor with honest reflection on the different challenges faced by those whose service remained classified for decades. As he worked on the address in the weeks leading up to the event, Harold found himself returning to conversations he'd had with families of the Black Hawk Valley team, with fellow veterans of classified operations, with young service members currently navigating the complex landscape of modern military service. From these diverse perspectives emerged the core of what he wanted to convey, not just about his own journey from silence to recognition, but about the broader implications for how a nation honors those who serve in ways that cannot be immediately acknowledged. The gathering was held in Washington, D.C., at a hotel within view of the Pentagon, a fitting location for a speech about the intersection of classified service and public recognition. As Harold took the stage, supported by a cane but standing, straight-backed and clear-eyed, he surveyed the audience before him, elderly veterans whose acts of extraordinary courage had defined their lives decades earlier, military officials responsible for current classification policies, family members who had supported loved ones through the complex aftermath of combat experiences, distinguished guests, Medal of Honor recipients, fellow veterans, Harold began, his voice steady despite the significance of the moment. I stand before you today representing a category of service member rarely acknowledged in public discourse, those who operated in the shadows under classification orders that silenced not just their actions, but often their very identities as participants in critical operations. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The Medal of Honor recognizes gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. It is presented publicly with ceremonial honor, ensuring that extraordinary acts of courage are never forgotten, that they become part of our national consciousness and historical record. But there exists another form of service, one that has traditionally remained invisible in our collective understanding of military sacrifice. Classified operations, intelligence gathering, special reconnaissance, covert actions deemed too sensitive for public acknowledgement have always been essential to national security. The men and women who undertake these missions do so knowing that their actions, regardless of outcome or personal cost, may never be publicly recognized, even decades later. Harold gestured to his own chest, empty of the decorations that adorned many in the audience. I wore no medals for 55 years after Operation Black Hawk Valley, not because valor was absent. My 15 teammates who never returned exhibited courage that would humble anyone in this room, but because the operation itself officially didn't exist. Classification orders, while necessary for operational security, created a silence that extended far beyond reasonable security concerns, affecting not just the historical record, but the lives of survivors and families. He looked directly at the Medal of Honor recipients in the front row. Your extraordinary actions were rightly celebrated, your sacrifice immediately honored, your place in history secured. For this, we are all grateful. But I ask you to consider those who served alongside you, whose actions remained classified, whose sacrifices went unacknowledged, whose place in history was redacted for decades or permanently. Consider what it means to return from combat unable to speak the names of fallen comrades outside classified briefings. Consider what it means for families to receive vague explanations about how their loved ones died, unable to take pride in the true nature of their sacrifice. Consider what it means to carry the weight of significant historical events that officially never happened. Harold shifted his approach, moving from the challenges to the progress made in recent years. The Black Hawk Valley project began as a personal quest to honor 15 men who deserved recognition they had never received. It evolved into something far more significant, a catalyst for institutional change, for new protocols governing the eventual declassification of operations, for a more humane approach to the human cost of necessary secrecy. He described the Silver Shield recognition ceremony, the establishment of the Historical Recognition Division, the ongoing efforts to identify classified operations eligible for declassification and appropriate honors. He spoke of the ripple effects, families finding closure, veterans released from decades of enforced silence, historical records made more complete and accurate. This progress doesn't diminish the importance of immediate recognition like the Medal of Honor, Harold emphasized. Rather, it acknowledges that our understanding of service and sacrifice must encompass both the heroism we can celebrate immediately and the contributions that, for valid security reasons, must remain temporarily hidden. Both are essential. Both deserve honor, even if that honor comes in different forms and on different timelines. As he concluded his address, Harold offered a perspective that bridged his unique experience with the universal challenges faced by all who serve in combat roles. In the end, whether our actions are immediately celebrated or temporarily classified, we who have served share something fundamental: the knowledge that we stood alongside comrades in moments of extreme challenge, that we made decisions under unimaginable pressure, that we carried out our duties as best we could with the information and resources available. The truest honor, I have come to believe, lies not in medals or public recognition, important though these are. It lies in knowing that we kept faith with those who served beside us, that we honored their sacrifice in whatever ways were available to us, that we ensured, immediately or eventually, that their story became part of our national understanding. For those whose service remains classified today, I offer this assurance: the systems are changing, the understanding is deepening. The path from necessary secrecy to appropriate recognition is being institutionalized. Your stories, when security concerns finally permit, will find their place in our collective history. Your sacrifice, however long unacknowledged, matters profoundly, and until that recognition becomes possible, know that there are those of us who understand the unique burden you carry, who honor your service even in its mandated silence. The response to Harold's address was immediate and powerful. A standing ovation led by the Medal of Honor recipients themselves, many visibly moved by perspectives they had never before considered. In the days that followed, military publications highlighted the speech as a watershed moment in how the nation conceptualized the full spectrum of service and sacrifice, from the most publicly celebrated acts of valor to the most carefully classified operations. More personally meaningful to Harold were the private conversations that occurred after the formal proceedings. Medal of Honor recipients sharing stories of classified aspects of their own service that had never been publicly acknowledged. Family members of classified operators expressing gratitude for articulating challenges they had faced in silence for years. Military officials committing to further reforms in how classified service was documented and eventually recognized. One elderly Medal of Honor recipient, decorated for actions in Vietnam that had made national headlines in the 1960s, spoke with Harold at length about the unacknowledged dimensions of his own service. What everyone knows about the action that earned the medal, that was just one day, he confided. There were months before and after, operations that are still classified, teammates whose names I still can't speak publicly. Your speech is the first time I've heard someone capture that reality in a way civilians might understand. As Harold prepared to return to Arizona, Dr. Reed approached him with news that placed the impact of his address in broader context. The Smithsonian has reached out, he explained. They're developing a new exhibition on classified operations throughout American military history. They want to use Black Hawk Valley as the centerpiece case study, and they've requested your involvement as a consultant. Harold considered this thoughtfully. The Smithsonian, that would reach millions of visitors annually. Dr. Reed nodded. Exactly. This isn't just about Black Hawk Valley anymore, or even about Vietnam-era operations. It's about establishing a framework for understanding classified service across conflicts and generations. Your perspective would be invaluable. The consultant role, which Harold ultimately accepted, represented a natural evolution of the work he had been doing since the original exhibition opened. Working remotely from Arizona, with occasional video conferences with the curatorial team, he helped shape an exhibition that would introduce the general public to the concept of classified service in a nuanced, historically accurate manner. The project extended beyond Harold's personal experience, incorporating recently declassified operations from World War II through Afghanistan. exploring the evolving policies governing classification and recognition, and examining the human impact on service members and families. When completed, Hidden Heroes Classified Operations in American Military History would stand as the first comprehensive public exhibition on a subject that had traditionally remained in the shadows of historical understanding. During this period of intense professional engagement, Harold's personal life continued to evolve in ways that would have seemed inconceivable 3 years earlier. His desert apartment, once sparsely furnished with the minimal possessions of a solitary life, gradually transformed into a warm, inviting space that reflected his expanding world. The digital picture frame Grace Whitley had given him as a departure gift now sat prominently on his living room bookshelf, cycling through an ever-growing collection of images. Photographs from gatherings with the Black Hawk Valley families, snapshots from veterans' events, pictures of meaningful moments shared with new friends at the retirement community. His bookshelves, once dominated by military histories and technical manuals, now included works of fiction, poetry collections, and art books that reflected broadening interests. The walls, previously bare except for maps and functional calendars, displayed his own desert landscapes in watercolors, paintings that improved steadily as he devoted more time to developing this unexpected talent. Most significantly, Harold's daily routine expanded beyond solitary activities to include regular social engagements, weekly dinners with Bill Pearson and other veterans, art classes at the community center, meetings of a history discussion group he had helped organize, occasional outings to museums and cultural events in Phoenix. "You know what strikes me most about you these days?" Pearson commented during one of their regular evening walks around the community grounds. "You laugh now, actually laugh out loud. I don't remember ever hearing that back in the day." Harold considered this observation. "I suppose there wasn't much to laugh about then or after for a long time. And now, Harold paused, watching the desert sunset paint the landscape in hues of gold and purple. "Now there seems to be a balance. The weight hasn't disappeared, the memories, the losses, the years of silence, but it's countered by something else. Purpose, perhaps, connection, the knowledge that it all meant something beyond itself." This balance was tested when Harold received news that Grace Whitley had suffered a stroke. Though not life-threatening, the event had left her with significant challenges that her family was struggling to address. Her grandson, James Jr., reached out to Harold directly. "She's asking for you," he explained during a phone call. "The doctors say familiar connections are important for recovery, and you've become an important part of her life these past few years. I know Arizona is a long way from here, but—" Harold didn't hesitate. "I'll make arrangements immediately." The journey back east was physically taxing for an 80-year-old with respiratory issues, but Harold undertook it without complaint. Bill Pearson insisted on accompanying him, arguing that his nursing background might prove useful, and more convincingly, that Harold shouldn't travel alone at his age. They found Grace in a rehabilitation facility, her condition stable, but her speech affected by the stroke. Her face brightened visibly when Harold entered the room, and she reached for his hand with surprising strength. "Arthur," she said, the name coming slowly, but clearly. "You came." Harold sat beside her bed, maintaining his gentle grip on her hand. "Of course I came. We're family, remember? You told me that yourself." Over the next 3 days, Harold spent hours at Grace's bedside, reading aloud from her favorite books, sharing updates on the Black Hawk Valley projects, and most importantly, reminiscing about James. Stories Harold had gathered from fellow team members, moments Grace remembered from their brief marriage, qualities they both had recognized in the man who connected them across decades. The rehabilitation specialists noted marked improvement in Grace's engagement and effort during this period. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," one therapist advised Harold. "This kind of emotional connection can accelerate recovery significantly." As his scheduled return to Arizona approached, Harold faced a decision that would have seemed unthinkable in his previous life of rigid routines and solitary habits. After consulting with Bill Pearson and speaking with Grace's family, he announced his intention to extend his stay indefinitely. "She needs consistent support right now," he explained to Dr. Reed during a video call. "Her family is doing everything possible, but they have work commitments, young children to care for. I can be here daily, provide the kind of conversation and memory engagement the specialists recommend." Dr. Reed studied Harold thoughtfully through the screen. "And your own health. The climate there isn't ideal for your respiratory issues." Harold nodded, acknowledging the concern. "True, but there are good medical facilities here, and Pearson has agreed to stay as well, at least initially. Some priorities transcend personal comfort." The decision to remain, initially expected to last a few weeks, extended into months as Grace made steady but gradual progress. Harold established a new routine: mornings at the rehabilitation facility, afternoons working remotely on the Smithsonian project, evenings with Grace's family or with Bill Pearson, who had found temporary accommodation nearby. As autumn approached, Grace improved enough to be discharged to her home with regular outpatient therapy and home health assistance. Harold and Pearson helped her family prepare for the transition, drawing on Pearson's nursing experience and Harold's meticulous attention to detail to ensure everything was properly arranged for her comfort and continued recovery. The evening before Grace's discharge, as Harold and Pearson walked through the rehabilitation facility's garden, Pearson broached a subject that had been increasingly on his mind. "You're not planning to go back to Arizona, are you?" he asked. Directly. Harold was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Not immediately, no. Grace will need ongoing support, and her family can't provide everything she needs while managing their other responsibilities." Pearson nodded. "And after she's stabilized, when she doesn't need daily visits anymore?" Harold stopped walking, looking out over the carefully tended garden where rehabilitation patients practiced walking on various surfaces: concrete paths, gravel sections, gentle slopes. "I've been thinking about that, about what comes next. And I'm wondering if I've reached a point where geography matters less than proximity to the people who matter. Arizona was good for my health, and I value the community we found. There, but here." He gestured vaguely, encompassing not just the immediate surroundings, but the broader area. "Here is where the Black Hawk Valley families are, where the museum is, where Grace is, where much of the work I care about is centered." Pearson smiled slightly. "Took you long enough to figure that out. I've had my Arizona apartment listed for sale for 3 weeks. Harold stared at his friend in surprise. "You never said anything." "Wanted you to reach your own conclusion without my influence," Pearson replied with a shrug. "Besides, I've already found a nice place near here. 2-bedroom condo in a building, with an elevator and good security. Second bedroom has excellent natural light, perfect for painting." He raised an eyebrow meaningfully. "Just saying." As they resumed walking, Harold found himself contemplating yet another unexpected turn in a life that had transformed repeatedly since that chance encounter in a museum 3 years earlier. From solitary veteran, bound by silence, to public figure helping shape national understanding of classified service. From a man defined by secrets, kept to a man defined by truths revealed. From someone who measured worth by promises maintained. In isolation, to someone who found meaning in connections that spanned generations and experiences. The path forward wasn't entirely clear yet. There were practical arrangements to be made, health considerations to address, new routines to establish. But the underlying direction was unmistakable, guided by priorities that would have seemed foreign to the Harold Thompson of 3 years ago, but now felt fundamentally right. As they completed their circuit of the garden, Harold paused once more, watching as a physical therapist helped an elderly stroke patient navigate a particularly challenging section of the path. The patient struggled, faltered, then regained balance with the therapist's assistance. Each step was difficult, but each represented progress, movement away from limitation toward recovery, from isolation toward connection, from what had been lost toward what might still be possible. There was, Harold reflected, a metaphor in that simple image that captured everything he had learned since emerging from the shadows of classified silence into the light of recognized service. That healing happens in community, that burdens shared become lighter, that even the longest journeys continue to reveal new destinations, new purposes, new opportunities to make meaning from experiences that once seemed only to limit and define. For a man who had spent most of his life carrying the weight of silence, this was perhaps the most significant discovery of all, that the end of secrecy wasn't simply the freedom to speak previously classified truths, but the beginning of connections that transformed those truths from burdens into bridges, from limitations into legacies that would continue long after the last witness had shared the final classified story. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.